Today, we are talking about the urgency of advocacy on climate solutions, and specifically the importance of faith to respond to this call to action. Please join me in welcoming our guests, Rabbi Jennie Rosenn, who's Executive Director of Dayenu, and Reverend Berndt, the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. So thank you for being here to you both. And you may note that we are missing our very dear friend, the Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley. Reverend Durley is unable to be with us today as he is attending the funeral services, the homegoing, if you will, for the Honorable Congressman John Lewis. And then for those of you who may not know, Reverend Durley actually marched alongside and fought alongside the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Congressman Lewis, Reverend C.T. Vivian, among so many others. And he continues that work now to call us all to our moral and civic responsibility to speak out, he would say forcefully, on the climate crisis, and certainly to pursue the world as God intended it. So Reverend Durley, he's eager to speak to you, and he committed to host a special episode with me on the environment, civil rights, and advocacy in the near future. But he wanted me to deliver to you all what his number one message for you today. He says, please honor Congressman Lewis by getting yourself and everyone you know to vote like you have never voted before. And so we're profoundly grateful for Congressman Lewis's call to action. Some of you may be just coming from viewing his live streamed funeral services. He was a man for justice, always deeply guided by his faith, and always in truth and love with unending wisdom teaching. So Reverend Durley would like us to begin the call today by just holding a very brief moment of silence in private reflection or prayer, as you will, before we begin. So let's just take half a minute to do that now. Just prayer and reflection. We'll start. All right, so welcome again to Jennie and Brooks. It is so important for us to take these moments to reflect and certainly to find rest for the work ahead, I think especially in the climate movement and this profoundly unusual time. So thank you all for indulging in that 20 minutes of quiet time. Brooks, first, I was wondering if you might have a reflection to share on Congressman Lewis's legacy and certainly the urgency of our climate crisis. I know you had an opportunity to meet him. So would you be willing to start us off by sharing that story?
Oh, sure. Thank you, Annie. And I'm grateful to be with all of you today and excited to share and talk with everyone. You know, so I did have the opportunity to once actually have dinner with Congressman John Lewis. I was one of about 8 people at a table. I was a senior in college at the time. It was June of 1998. So I'm giving away my age there. But Congressman Lewis came to give a distinguished lecture at the school I was a senior at, Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And somehow I was selected to be one of those students who got to have dinner with him. And you know, and what I remember about that occasion is at the time I was a student with a lot of energy, and when I showed up to class, it wasn't so much to have a polite discussion of ideas. I showed up to do intellectual battle. I was one of those kind of students, and so I had a little bit of that spirit with me that night. I'm somewhat embarrassed to say. And so all these years later, what I remember most about that night isn't the ideas, but it was the way that Congressman Lewis engaged me. That he engaged me with this gracious humility. And I think about that as kind of a model for how we engage this work, right? We can get caught up in the ideas, but it's also really important the kind of person we are when we enter into the movement. because people aren't going to listen to you, if you don't enter the movement with as much grace and humility and willingness to work with other people. And so when I was a pastor, I had members of my church who were wood carvers, and they used to talk to me about the art of wood carving, and that when they would carve, they always had a model to look at, something that they were trying to, carve a knotty piece of wood into looking like that model. And that's the way I think of myself in trying to honor Congressman Lewis today, is that I'm this knotty piece of wood, and he's the model that I'm trying to craft myself into emulating the kind of work that he did in the struggle for justice. And so he was a great model for all of us, and just, a real treasure for our entire country and the world.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you for sharing that story. And my colleague Jess is chatting out some helpful resources here, and I would just encourage everyone to check out the piece that he posthumously was posted in the New York Times today, that I think, Brooks, really speaks to what you were just sharing, just this opportunity to take the wheel and keep moving forward in a place of hope. And I think that's really important right now for all of us. So I wanted to really start us off by talking about the fact that we know that this is a critical and urgent moment in time for acting on climate change. Every single episode that we do of this channel talks about that. But I really wanted to hear from you both about why you find this moment particularly important to mobilize faith communities, and what is that unique, that special, that challenging point about this moment? What are the unique gifts that faith communities have to offer to the movement? And so, Jennie, Rabbi Rosenn, I'd have us start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Annie. And I just want to say it's wonderful to be here with you, Reverend Berndt, and the Let's Talk Climate community of listeners. I'm so sorry not to have Reverend Durley here with us, but I'm really moved that at this very time, he's honoring the life of John Lewis and accompanying his family in this real time of loss. So grateful for this conversation. So I think to begin, faith communities are needed in part because, as you said, time is of the essence, and we need all hands on deck if we're going to avert the worst of climate catastrophe. And this includes all communities, including faith communities. So that's sort of on a very utilitarian level. I think more specifically, religious voices play an important role in shaping our national narratives and in solutions that are rooted in values, religious values that are universal, like ensuring the centrality of human dignity, like social justice, like valuing not only the individual, but also the public good. And religious communities can also raise up really important moral voices. And I've always been struck by the way that political leaders often hear these voices differently than they do when groups show up from a secular organization. Whether that's right or not, I don't know, but I have noticed that political leaders often respond differently. I think there's also power in spiritually rooted activism, the way that we can bring religious experience and teachings and traditions and faith and song to the movement. I want to just speak for a minute, if I can, to another part of your question, Annie, which was about the uniqueness of this moment. Because I think we have known for a long time that our world is broken, right? Well before the coronavirus pandemic hit, we knew that we couldn't just continue to live the way we've been living and expect that our children and grandchildren would have a safe planet to live on. But the deep disruption that's been caused by the coronavirus, I think, has really put these truths into much sharper focus. And I also think people have been experiencing the profound interconnectedness that we have in a new way. I think we have a new knowledge of what disruption feels like. We have a new knowledge of what happens when governments fail to prepare and respond adequately. We are experiencing what happens when we don't listen to science. And so I think the pandemic has awakened, even among the most comfortable of us, to the fragility of our systems, right? Our food systems and our health systems and our education systems. And so I think that many of us are getting in a new way the threat of climate collapse. And this time of disruption and destruction has given us a new opportunity. We have this unexpected opportunity to re-envision and rebuild the world, a fundamentally religious undertaking and also a secular undertaking, to re-envision and not to bolster just the same unjust economies or the same polluting infrastructure, but to dream big, to really envision and bring to life something profoundly different. And then of course, the other power shaping this time is not just the pandemic, but the uprisings for Black lives that has really put into sharper relief for many the systemic racism that pulses through our nation. I think it's heightened our awareness of the insidiousness of white supremacy and how Black, brown, and Indigenous people bear the weight of injustice. And that's certainly true with the climate crisis, right? That rests disproportionately on those who've been historically marginalized, people living in the global South and in poverty and particularly vulnerable areas, and people who experience racism and all sorts of kind of bigotry. So, I think about the climate crisis as a force multiplier, if you will, right? Exacerbating historical inequities. And like coronavirus, climate and the climate crisis affects everyone, but it doesn't affect everyone equally. So I think that these realizations that folks are having about what climate chaos and collapse could feel like, about the way that climate justice and racial justice, economic justice are all interconnected, and this unexpected opportunity to re-envision and rebuild, I think all of these things have really given us new opportunities for movement building.
Brooks, what would you add to that? What are you seeing as this unique moment and the unique value of faith communities leaning in?
Yeah, I think faith communities offer a number of gifts to the broader climate movement, and in particular, this period of multiple crises that we face. And to tie into what Jennie was just saying, I think part of the reason why elected officials and others will respond differently to a religious message sometimes has to do with the fact that one of our gifts is that we're able to often fundamentally articulate what motivates people and why people act, right? So when we talk about love and when we talk about justice, when we talk about our values, they're not just hallmark sentiments. They're something that are rooted in the core of who we are. They're rooted in our faith, and God is our power source, right, for love and for justice. And so I think that gives us just a unique place from which we operated, that faith rootedness that Jennie talked about. So I think that's a real gift that we bring. I think another thing is that we have these traditions of theological traditions of how do we deal with moments of crisis. And I know, coming out of my tradition, there's a whole crisis theology. You could call it Kairos theology. Kairos is a Greek word that was used by Jesus. It signifies the right action taken at the right time. And it's come to mean really that these right actions at the right time typically occur in moments of crisis. And so you've got Paul Tillich, famous theologian, who's in the trenches as a chaplain, and he's figuring all this out, and he says, it's in this crisis that there can be these God-charged moments that are paradoxically crisis and opportunity at the same time. Mm-hmm. And then in South Africa, during one of the worst parts of apartheid, you had people gathering together in Soweto, and they came up, this was lay people, clergy, gathering in people's living rooms, and they came up with something called the Kairos document. And they kind of built upon this idea that not only can this be a God-charged moment in the midst of crisis, but it's also a moment of truth. It's when we find God is issuing us a call to see where do we stand right now. And there's no sitting on the fence. One has to take a side, and it's revealing the truth about who we are as a people of faith in that moment. And then you had Martin Luther King Jr. also talk about Kairos as being a moment of history that's pregnant. It's a moment that's, ready to give birth to a great idea and a great movement. And I think that's what we're in right now. We're in a moment in which we see, as Jennie mentioned, we see a movement coming forth. It's a time in which history is pregnant with possibility as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so that's, I think, part of, the theology is how we understand these moments of crisis is something we bring. And then the last thing I'll just mention real quickly is, for millennia, we've been dealing with things like grief. How do you cope with grief, and how do you cope with fear? And I think that's fundamental to how we deal with this climate crisis, right? Grief and fear are real. There's grief over the loss that we've already experienced. And then there's what's called anticipatory grief. That's, we see the storm on the horizon and are grieving the loss that we're anticipating will come. And so, we know as kind of people of faith, right, we've been accompanying people through the forest of grief for millennia, right? And so we know that you can't go over it, around it, under it. You have to go through that forest of grief, and we accompany each other as we do that. And so I think, there's a lot of gifts that we bring to the table that come out of that.
Thanks, Brooks. And I actually want to get to that concept of accompaniment in a moment. So let's put a pin in that for just a second. But I was hearing, Jennie talk about, the authenticity that people of faith can bring, and this real call, Brooks, to move forward now. And so I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on how we can bring forward something that's bigger, that's bolder, that's a louder version of advocacy, particularly in the faith community on climate right now? And Jennie, I'll turn to you first. Your organization, I know, was founded to bring forth this kind of renewed spiritual audacity, I think is what how it's described for climate change, which I love that. So can you tell us about, your organization, Dayenu? What does Dayenu mean? And why is the organization called Dayenu? And how can people connect with your work?
Sure. So Dayenu, our tagline is a Jewish call to climate action, is a new Jewish organization. We actually launched at the end of April. An auspicious time to be launching a new organization, but there is such a need to be, as I was saying before, having all hands on deck. And so Dayenu is seeking to mobilize the American Jewish community to confront the climate crisis with, as you said, spiritual audacity and bold political action. So it's a national organization, multi-generational and spiritually rooted, really centering justice. And we work in partnership with other faith climate groups, with secular climate organizations, and a lot of Jewish organizations, and really understand ourselves as a small part of a much bigger movement. And organizing Dayenu circles around the country to engage in national campaigns. Some of the bold opportunities of the moment, like Just Green Recovery, and we're gearing up for some nonpartisan election work as well, and organizing on the grassroots level and on the Jewish institutional level. The other dimension, and I'm so glad that you mentioned this, is that it's not only about bold political action, which is so needed, but also about the spiritual adaptation. How do we support people to confront the grief? I think so often it's so overwhelming. It's so overwhelming to imagine what the future could be, that anticipatory grief. And so for us to be able to hold people through that, as you were saying, you can't go around grief, through it, both because that's part of what it means to live as an integrated person, to not just look away or disassociate, but really face that truth. And it's part of how you do that is by acting. So it's part of also building a broader base and a broader movement. So, I think about sort of how do we move from facing the truth with all the grief and anxiety that brings, and moving towards courageous action. So Dayenu, the word Dayenu, it's a song of gratitude that we sing each year at the Passover Seder, when we retell the story of the Jewish people's slavery movement from slavery in Egypt to freedom. And the song, which is sort of lustily sung and a song that many Jews, even less observant Jews, often know, recounts all the things that God has done. And it says, like, if God had done this for us, but not that, Dayenu, it would have been enough. If God had taken us out of Egypt, but not given us the Torah, Dayenu, it would have been enough. So we've sort of taken that and shifted it, because Dayenu literally means we've had enough. So we named the organization Dayenu to say, we've had enough destruction, enough insufficient action, enough. But Dayenu also means we have enough. We have what we need. We have the science. We have the technology. We have the people. We have what we need to create a different future so that all people can have enough.
Yeah, wow. I think that's so profound and powerful. And, Brooks, always feel free to jump in here, but, just the connections here between what you were just sharing and what Jennie just shared is really important. And I hope folks are hearing it in the audience. I'm curious, maybe we can stick with this just for a moment. Brooks, you have a new book that just came out, Cathedral on Fire. But I know you also were involved in developing the Earth Day resources for Creation Justice Ministries, which I know you sit on the board of, some congregational tools and resources for folks to use, not just during Earth Day, but throughout the year, focused on this fierce urgency of now, on climate, really hearkening back to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's calling so many years ago. And so I'm curious, thinking about both resources, particularly your book, what would it look like for people of faith to embrace this call to action and increase our ambition to really solve this crisis to you?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. I think a lot of my thinking on this has been partially inspired by some of the great activism that's taken place from young people recently. I work with a group of about 70 members of my denomination from around the country. It's called the Council for Climate Justice. And we were engaging the executive director for the Sunrise Movement, Varshini Prakash. And we're asking her, well, what can we do as faith communities, to support the Green New Deal? And what she said to us was that, we're not just calling on the government to do an all-out mobilization to address climate and inequality over the next 10 years. We're calling on all institutions to do an all-out mobilization to address climate and inequality. And so we thought about that, and we thought, well, that would mean that we need to call on all of our churches, right, to do an all-out mobilization to address climate and inequality, to develop a plan for doing that over the next 10 years, to really think, how can we muster the most? And so the council ended up issuing a Kairos call to action, building on that theological tradition. And then they came up with kind of 10 ideas for what faith communities, churches in this instance could do. And so, they really tried to kind of be broad and inclusive in thinking about what people can do. And so, we always think about worship as being a fundamentally important place to start, right? Because that's kind of like the central activity of the faith community in some ways. It's when everybody gets together. And so having a moment for us every Sunday where you're talking about these things. It's not just a once a year Earth Sunday kind of thing. This is, central to who we are in our faith tradition. Our first calling is to care for God's creation, right? Just biblically speaking, and so what does that mean to make that central to our DNA? Well, we should be talking about this every week when we get together as people of faith. And so
even virtually.
Even virtually. Yep, that's right. And so that's, just a kind of a first starting place for us. And then other things that to build on Reverend Gerald Durley's admonition that we get involved in voting like never before. Well, that's part of it too. We have something called the Creation Care Voter Pledge. We encourage our members to make a pledge to not just vote, but to vote their values and to consistently vote. And so that means, when you enter into the voting booth, caring for God's creation, caring for racially and economically marginalized communities that are impacted often the most severely by climate and environmental destruction and ruin. And so that's the kind of thing that we put in there as well, trying to be a hub for mobilizing people within one's community, offering your space to local groups, doing whatever you can to further the cause. And so it could mean changing the landscape of your property so that you're sucking more carbon out of the air based on how you just do the physical landscape of your property. So we try to, again, be all inclusive, you know, and so those are just a few of the 10-point plan of action that they crafted and put together.
I think people often appreciate having a plan that they can follow. I want to actually stay with you for just a minute because you reference obviously what we talk about a lot, which are the inequities of climate change and understanding that they're really rooted in systems of injustice and in racism. And you know, the United Church of Christ, your home denomination, has been at the forefront of some of that work, you know, going back decades at this point, including the publication of Toxic Waste and Race in the early 80s. And I'm just curious, you know, what do you see in terms of the relevancy of that original report, you know, on today? What would you encourage folks to kind of bring forward into this moment?
Yeah, I'm really fortunate to kind of have a job where I can, you know, I connect to the living legacy of the origins of the environmental justice movement in Warren County, North Carolina, where people like the Reverend Ben Chavis, the Reverend Leon White, and Dolly Burwell were central to the watershed events in the environmental justice movement in terms of the placement of toxic PCBs in Warren County, predominantly Black. And in terms of the state of North Carolina, it was the county with the highest percentage of Black population, one of the 2 counties with the highest proportion of people living in poverty. So there, you know, that movement got kickstarted with, you know, 5-6 weeks of civil disobedience in which over 500 people got arrested. It was kind of like the Standing Rock of 1982. And people from all over the country got involved. And so it then led, as you mentioned, to a report that was the first kind of comprehensive report to document environmental racism throughout the United States in terms of the placement of toxic waste facilities. And you know, and really the reality of that all these many years later, since we published that report in 1987, is things haven't really changed. That's still the reality that we face when it comes to the placement of toxic waste facilities today, that they're often located near communities of color and low-income neighborhoods. And so that's just a repeated pattern that we continue to see as part of the fabric of our country. So we, this past year on Ash Wednesday, February 26, we released another environmental justice report. In this one, we decided, in many ways, we were responding to the rollback of now, the current administration has sought to roll back 100 or more environmental protections. I like to call them protections, not regulations, because they're what protects, you know, humans and children, yeah, and our environment, right? And so, so we're talking about the rollback of protections. And what we realize, you know, we know that when it comes to, you know, what happens when you roll back a protection, those who are most likely to suffer the consequences of that are again going to be Black communities, indigenous communities, low-income neighborhoods. And biologically, we're talking about children, right? Children are the ones who are most impacted by the pollution that gets out there. And so we decided that we would look at air pollution this time because of the devastating impact that has on children, looking at toxic chemicals. And so, you know, that was eye-opening just to realize in our nation just how many children live within 3 miles or 1 mile of our super polluters in this country. And one way to think about it is a lot of us are familiar with flint, kids getting metals, heavy metal, lead, heavy metal in the water, entering their body, causing lifelong neurological damage and so forth. Well, these plants often are emitting heavy metals, maybe not lead, but other heavy metals like nickel. And so it's like the airborne version of flint. And so, what we know in looking at the top 100 polluters is that they tend to be heavily concentrated in places like Houston, places like Cancer Alley, that stretch of Louisiana that runs along the Mississippi River from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. And so again, you're looking at, largely communities of color, and you're looking at low-income neighborhoods that are most impacted by these heavy concentrations of pollution. And, so we wanted to, look at all the dimensions of who is impacted. And I'll just kind of close up by, there's a lot I could say about it, but a couple of things.
We chatted it out here so people can go and check it out.
Yeah, I'll just mention kind of three notable things that, came out of that report that were somewhat unexpected for me. One was that there's a lot of invisible kind of, under the radar pollution that, when we think of pollution, we think of the big smokestacks and, and I realized that, well, one of the top 100, I drove by nearly every day on my way to work. It was in Cleveland, a metalworks fabrication plant, and they don't have any big things. It looks like a warehouse, and this is in a part of Cleveland that suffers some of the highest rates of lead poisoning in the nation. They have a history of multiple forms of environmental injustice. And so now on top of that, we're learning, a lot of us didn't know this until the report, that there's this, significant threat to the children's health in the neighborhood that's predominantly Black. And so that was one thing that, came out of it. Another thing was, realizing that I know your BlessedTomorrow and ecoAmerica work a lot with people in medical and health fields. Two of the top 10 polluters are involved in medical instrument sterilization. Midwest Sterilization owns two of the top polluting facilities in our report. And so you realize that we have this unjust society in which, in order to keep some people safe and healthy, you make other people more sick, right? And so you have, in Cancer Alley, you've got 11 facilities that pollute that kind of, toxic chemical into the air, right? And so that's another thing that jumped out. And then sadly, the other thing that became significant about the report is that we know that higher mortality rates from COVID-19 are in communities like Cancer Alley because people who have had their lungs damaged over years and years of toxic chemical pollution then are extremely susceptible to dying from COVID-19. And so some of the highest death rates in the country have been in Cancer Alley as a result. And so that's another thing that has come out from the report. Related
so sobering.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because you were talking about, there's this important documentation of this, and we as people of faith can really bear witness to these facts, to these truths, and rooted in our unique faith traditions. And I recognize that today is the Jewish fast day of Tish B'Av, which commemorates the destruction of the ancient temple. And so I want to ask Jennie, thinking about the sobering truths, like Brooks just shared, how do you see Tish B'Av relating to what we're talking about, if at all, to the climate crisis, and certainly to this sense of urgency and acting that we're discussing today?
So, one of the things that we bring as people of faith is sort of this arc of history, and of the way that Brooks alluded to earlier, deal with crisis. And so today is Tisha B'Av. It's the 9th day. That means literally the 9th day of the month of Av in the Jewish calendar. It's one of the months. And it's a major day of communal grieving. And it's a day on which we mourn many tragedies and expulsions, and has been expanded in modern time to reflect all different kinds of grief. Last night I participated in a commemoration on Tisha B'Av that was actually then focused on climate grief and grief for the earth. But most specifically, Tisha B'Av commemorates, as you said, the destruction of the ancient temple in Jerusalem. And the story of that destruction is actually one of radical transformation, right? The destruction of the temple meant the end of the sacrificial system and the birth of rabbinic Judaism. It's actually a really incredibly powerful example of a complete paradigmatic and societal transformation, because it was a shift from sacrificial offerings on the temple altar as the way of practicing Judaism to a practice of deeds and prayer and the Judaism that we know, that we all know today. So what comes after the temple is a story of rebuilding, not the same structures, but whole different ways of life that transformed Jewish civilization into a new era. And I think we can all think about many times in our own histories and traditions throughout history when there's been some kind of profound reinvention. And the times when there's a need for profound reinvention. And right now we're in such a time. And I think what's important for us to kind of hold in the forefront is in such times, we need bold reinvention. It's not about incremental change. And we know that is so much the case in the climate crisis when we don't have time for incremental change. We need response and solutions that are at the scale that science and justice demand. And none of us can sit that out. And that means really calling on a vision for transformation as a society to a new way.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that context. And I think one of the things that I want to share here is actually a question from the audience, if we can turn to our audience questions. And again, if you are listening and have a question, feel free to chat to us, just select the all panelists option. But we have a question here from Iphigenia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who wants to know, how does religious advocacy translate into political action? And have you seen results of your advocacy work in policymaking? Maybe if you can give some examples so we can see how this actually plays out in real time, in real life. Either one of you can start.
So I can give an example, and I'll say, as an organization that is, 2.5 months old, we don't have a long track record, but I want to hold up an example of how I think it can translate. So we, as I was mentioning, a just green recovery, one that prioritizes clean energy jobs and that prioritizes climate justice and holding polluters accountable, and clean energy and reduction of emissions, is paramount right now. And we're in a moment where the Congress, as it's debating stimulus, and the presidential candidates, as they are determining their platforms, are making real choices. And so the campaign that we recently did in alignment with many other climate organizations was to mobilize Jews to write letters to the presidential campaigns and candidates, and to do video messages about why a just green recovery is important to them as Jews, and putting together a compilation of all of those videos. And we're now pivoting to letters to Congress and having Jewish institutions sign on to a letter to Congress as they're debating right now, probably as we sit here, what the bill looks like. So you can, as you know, Biden recently came out with a much bolder climate plan than where he started. As with all things, we would never say that it was because of what, this group of a constellation of Jewish climate organizations and other faith climate organizations and secular climate organizations did in calling for a just green recovery. And clearly that is the kind of voice and raising up of policy in a particular context of values that can really make a difference, and that collectively does shift I think, over time, the discourse, and in turn, what policies look like and how candidates land.
Brooks, I mean, where have you seen, the advocacy work that you help to mobilize through the Creation Justice Network and the church, widely make a difference or move forward?
Yeah, I guess I always have to acknowledge the history that's come before me. And so, I always begin with that history I alluded to earlier about the birth of the environmental justice movement. And now, all these many years later, and this really came to me through an interview I did with Charles Lee, the primary author of the Toxic Waste and Race Report. And I'll share that here in the chat box. But he best articulates the impact, the far-reaching impact that movement had, that you now have environmental justice laws on the books, right, at the federal, state, and local levels, throughout, much of the country. And so he's really good. And now Charles Lee himself works in the EPA, and an institution that has been very changed. We can say what's happened in under the past administration, but prior to that, right, all of these changes that really resulted in the institution of the EPA that wouldn't have happened without the environmental justice movement. And so he captures that better than probably anybody. But the other thing I would say, for me, I got into the environmental movement as a pastor, and I was concerned about climate change. I discovered that the leading source of pollution in my state at the time where I was a pastor, the state of Washington, was the state's only coal plant. And just so happened the Sierra Club was launching a campaign to transition the state away from that coal plant, ultimately a successful campaign. And that was, really what kind of got me on fire. And I think, the reality is when you're in a movement, you're always one part of it, a larger movement. But I think faith communities are a really critical part. And I experienced that in that campaign. Earth Ministry is an organization based in Seattle. They had some great leadership during that campaign. They were very good at, and this I think was reflective of what faith communities often bring to the table, is being mindful of social and economic inequalities when engaging these negotiations with a large corporation, with the state of Washington, the governor's office, and saying, look, we need to have the workers at the table. We need to be mindful of how what's going to happen when we transition away from this plant, and making sure that workers are at the table saying what they want to have happen is for a just transition. And so, really it's, obviously the workers who are doing, they're speaking for themselves, but the faith community is able to come in there and offer a moral lens and perspective that I think is helpful in moving things forward in the right direction, in articulating, being part of that push for a just transition. And so it led to some first of its kind, enactments when the government and the corporation and the unions and the Sierra Club and faith groups all came together to hash out how that transition would happen. Well, it was, determined that there would be money that would be devoted towards a just transition for the workers. And I've done webinars with people in the labor movement, and that's one of the things they point to as one of the best examples. We can always do a better job, but it's actually what they point to as one of the top examples of what they're able to do in that instance with that plant. And so just we were, maybe it would have happened without us, but I think that we were an important part, the faith community was an important part of shaping that and putting, showing up at rallies, and so forth, and being part of that larger movement.
Well, I'm curious. So one of the questions, the other questions that just came in is from Carolyn, who is, we're talking about the great impact that the faith communities can have in policymaking, but they have to be mobilized to do so first. And so she asks, how can we work to mobilize faith communities who aren't already mobilized, who aren't already focused on creation care? And I know both of you work in this space. And I think it's one of the primary goals for Dayenu, right, with the circles that you're creating. So Jennie, maybe we can start with you. How can we help to mobilize communities who aren't already mobilized?
Sure. So Dayenu has a distributed leadership model in which anyone can start a Dayenu circle. It's a group of 5 to 15 people who want to take action on climate, in this case in a Jewish context. But I think the model, there's something particularly Jewish about the model itself, which is that it could start in someone's living room with 10 or 15 friends. It could start in a congregation with the green team. It could start at a nursery school with a parents group. And the idea is that they, come together and can then engage in Dayenu national campaigns with training and webinars and support from Dayenu, and may at the same time be working on their local incinerator, or maybe greening their institution, or maybe, and I think that's so important in how we organize now, that it not be that they're chapters and they're but that there's flexibility there, and that people have an opportunity to do this in community. I can't emphasize that enough in terms of how we ground this work and sustain ourselves for the long haul.
Brooks, what would you add, or what kind of approach do you take in helping to catalyze new communities to start doing this work?
Yeah, I think it's always important just to begin with the fundamentals, making sure people understand that this is, central to who we are as people of faith, for us, God created a covenant not just with humans, but with all of creation. So we're part of this interconnected web of creation, and we have responsibilities and obligations as part of that interconnected web of creation. And so just beginning, to get people to realize that this is part of who we are as people of faith, I think is just, for me, always the starting point. The other thing I think is really, important, and I know ecoAmerica and BlessedTomorrow are always on top of, why people get involved. And we know that, a big part of reason why people get involved, people of faith get involved, is love of children. And so people are really concerned about their children and grandchildren, the world that they're in the process of inheriting. And so being able to focus people's attention, like, you love your children, that's why it's important to act on this, right? And getting people to connect the dots and to realize, and I think that, at times means lifting up the voices of children and youth. We've had a campaign to encourage youth preaching from the pulpit, because one of our longtime veterans in our denomination for doing environmental work, he said after he heard a high schooler preach in the worship service, it was the most powerful environmental themed worship service he had ever experienced. This is like over 30 years we're talking, there's something different. I think youth in many ways are our climate prophets. And so, it's one thing for me, or, someone who's, 50 plus years old, to talk about climate. It's another thing to hear your child or grandchild or someone their age talking about how this is impacting them and will impact them. I think it really, that's a real key part in getting a kind of that spark and getting people towards action.
Amen. And I just would encourage folks to think about attending. We have our American Climate Leadership Summit, which is our annual summit happening virtually every Thursday during the month of August. And on the 13th, we're going to be hosting a youth panel where we're actually bringing several youth as young as high school students up to recent college graduates who are leading in some of this work. So I would encourage you all to register and attend. Well, we had a question come in here that I think actually builds on what Brooks was just sharing. So maybe we can take that as our last audience Q&A, and then I'd like to turn it over to you all for one quick last round before we close with the question that I'll ask. But Alan asks, there are faith communities that argue against climate action, and members of his own church are against climate change action. So how do we deal with the heterogeneity of the faith community in this movement? And Brooks, I know you were just talking about the importance of connecting on common values, connecting directly with people's existing interests. But I'm curious if there's anything else you all want to share.
I think part of this actually goes back to the generational piece that Brooks was just talking about. I think that those changes will happen with generational changes. There's so far you can get, sort of with the arguments, if you will, and then the next line of engagement is really around those shared values and really digging deep. I think that there's a lot of denial that is not kind of literal denial, but more emotional denial because it is so painful to look at. And then I think that there's some people who will not be moved for whatever set of reasons, and that generations and time, and sadly, the increasing number of impacts that we're going to all be experiencing will over time shift those parts of all religious denominations. We all have them, just in different proportions, if you will. But I think that you'll see, and this is actually, you can see this with young evangelicals as an example, who really, are taking the lead. And I think that that's reflected in all faith traditions, that generational shift, which will from youth in an inspiring way and from climate impacts in a devastating way, shift things over time fairly quickly.
So just thanks to our audience for participating and for asking these great questions. Before we close out, I just wanted to ask each of you if you would share, what do you want to leave the audience with today as a call to action? I think it's just important to know, our audience, they're not necessarily all people of faith. So what would you be asking them to do, whether it's today or maybe over the next couple of months? So that's one. And then two, if you have a word or a practice of hope that you want to leave people with, please share that as well.
Yeah, I'll answer the previous question and tie that into my thoughts on action. I think, one always has to discern what's best given your own local context. I think there's good reason now, just given how many people have an understanding of climate change as something that's human caused and something that really needs action right now. I think, the place to discern energy is maybe not on trying to convert more people to the choir, but to organize the choir and to organize the choir to go out and sing in the streets. And I think that's really kind of figuring out how to do that in your particular context is the real call to action. And then to also think about, what's been named in this call is that we're in a situation that really requires large scale change that really has to occur at the level of our federal government ultimately. And so tailoring one's actions, knowing that that's ultimately where we need to go and we need to go fast. And so I think that, for me, that means joining with Reverend Durley and thinking about the importance of elections and who, voting into office people who reflect our values and realize the urgency of the moment and the need to act on a large scale. And there I'm talking about the Green New Deal. And so with all the courage, ambition, that we can muster to do that. And so that's, I think, what I would say, as far as thinking about a call to action.
It's a good thing to say, Brooks. Thank you. Jennie, what about you? Hope you're still muted.
Sorry. Similarly, I would say my call to action would be to really think about the systemic level. Obviously, what we do as individuals, people talk about consuming less meat or other personal practices, institutional practices like greening institutions, all of that is important. And if everybody did that and everybody reduced their carbon footprint personally, it would not it would not sufficiently in any way bring us to where we need to be. And so the change that we need to be mobilizing around is on the systemic level. And that means things like, what does a just green recovery look like in this moment? And it means things like voting with climate in mind and calling on our politicians and candidates to be bold in their climate plans, and getting folks who we know are concerned about climate out to vote with climate in mind. So I just want to make a really strong sort of plug for systemic change that we need to be orienting towards if we stand a chance of really reaching net zero emissions in the way that we need to, and building a just and equitable green economy. And in terms of a moment, sort of ending on a note of hope, I would say two things. I know for me, song and things that move my spirit are what sustain me. And I think for everyone that's different what those things are, but we're in a moment where we need to really understand, how do we tap into our own wells of strength and courage and spirit, even if it's not religious spirit, kind of what sustains our spirits, and making sure that we're tapping into those wells. And then finally, we need to remember that we're not alone, that we can do this in community, and that we need community in order to sustain ourselves and each other in this really urgent and sacred work.
Amen. Oh, it's so wonderful. Thank you both for joining us as our guests today. We're at the end of our time together, but I do hope that this has inspired the audience maybe to think about how we can all be increasing our ambition and our resolve for climate solutions. So I want to say thanks to our listeners. You're here because you're passionate, and your passion is important. Your commitment is really needed. Your partnership is valued. We as faith leaders invite you to partner with us as the faith community. Your work is our future, and we are with you. We support you. Please check out the United Church of Christ's environmental resources. Please check out Dayenu. And I want to encourage you all, again, I mentioned this earlier, but our American Climate Leadership Summit begins next Thursday. So please check us out. You can register here with this link and access our full agenda and speakers. So please engage with us online. Use the hashtag Let's Talk Climate. Be sure to subscribe and follow us for the latest thought leadership resources and episodes on climate action and advocacy. And as Reverend Durley called us, please vote, encourage others to vote. Check out ecoAmerica's voting resources if you don't know how to vote, or if you want to share with others resources so that they can do so. So God bless you all. Be safe. Until next time, we really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.